Welcome to the Focus on Why podcast. I'm Amy Rowlandson and I ask my guests one simple question. Why? Focusing on the importance of why, I share with you the relatable, uplifting and inspiring conversations I have with people from all walks of life. This podcast will encourage you to focus on your why to enable and empower you to achieve the success you desire. Have a purpose, have a plan, focus on why. Today on the Focus on Why podcast, I am joined by Jackie Handy. Jackie, welcome.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Amy. It's great to be here. Thank you.
Well, we have only just met this year, so it's a new friendship that we formed, and we have had a huge amount of fun online because obviously we haven't had a chance to meet in person yet. But we have met through the PSA and we've been to several events where we've had sort of online giggles. I think Quiz Tag was probably the greatest moment of all time. But ever since then, we've just sort of kept in touch and talked about various things in what we're doing. And that's what I'd like to explore more today with you. So first off, Jackie, what is it that you do?
Okay, so I work with organisations globally, helping them to embed inclusion into their culture in terms of the behaviours of every single person within the organisation, and to give them a deeper sense of the importance of their words and the impact that behaviour and those words can have on those around them. That's what I do.
And you talk about embedding inclusion. Why is it not already embedded?
People like to think it is, and that's the interesting thing. And I think it's one of those. As I say a lot in my training work, we don't know what we don't know, and really, unless perhaps you've had a lived experience, or indeed you've been an observer to something that's felt uncomfortable in some kind of way, you can't really take a judgment as to whether inclusion is embedded in your business. And it's interesting at the moment because this year, I think, has been, of course, for many reasons, a year like no other. And I think the same has been true in parts of the diversity and inclusion space. And after the sad killing of George Floyd in May, I think the world has, I don't really like the term woke, but I do think the world has become more conscious of the microaggressions, the ingrained, indoctrinated, exclusive terms and behaviours that are used. And so I do think that people now are have perhaps thought, I thought inclusion was embedded. I thought I was inclusive, but now I realise that actually, due to my own set of circumstances, which of course all of our circumstances are unique, there perhaps have been times where I've behaved or I've spoken in a way that could have excluded somebody, or I was going to say at best, but it's not at best, but, at worst, perhaps, really offended and upset somebody. And much of that would have been done probably unintentionally. But I think, again, talking about the George Floyd situation, and of course, diversity comes in many forms, but this has just been, heavily prevalent in the news and so forth. I think people recognise that, maybe there have been times that perhaps they've said or done something that is not racist, but is also not anti-racist, and that's where the focus is, certainly in terms of race and colour and ethnicity right now. And I recognise that organisations now are starting to have a deeper passion for embedding inclusion in all its forms across their culture of their organisation.
So it's not enough just to become conscious of it.
Right. So, I mean, you're probably familiar with the change curve, and the stages of the change curve. And, funnily enough, the first stage of the change curve is, we don't know what we don't know. We're kind of, unconsciously incompetent, if you like. Doesn't mean we're stupid. We're just unaware. And of course, the movement then, I'm sure your listeners understand the change curve as well, but just for clarity, then we start to move into that phase of conscious incompetence. Well, now I become aware of what I didn't know. And then, of course, I think people are starting to approach that space, and even for some moving into that conscious competence, which means that they're really open to changing things, taking small steps, which is what I advocate, small steps forward to really make a difference in their business and in their lives and to the people around them. And gradually what will happen, and it's like with any new habit that forms, we reach a point once we've had that consistency of unconscious competence. And that's the point that I'm looking to help organizations reach, whereby actually they now are inclusive without thinking about it. There no longer has to be diversity and inclusion strategies in organizations, because it kind of sounds like it's a one-time only thing, but it's so much part of the embodiment of an organization, really, and its culture. So that's the sort of journey that I look to take people on. And to answer your question then in a nutshell, no, it isn't enough just to be conscious of it. It is the first step, however, to be mindful of it, and then to challenge your own behavior and language, and the behavior and language that you see and witness from others.
So this is what you're doing now. You're helping people become unconsciously competent. What is it you were doing before?
Well, I was a recruiter, actually. So I was a recruitment consultant for around about 15 years. I helped people find jobs, and I helped customers find employees. And it all sounds very nice, doesn't it? And it was a great, a very purpose-filled job, actually. And but of course it was a heavy sales role. So my job was to sell in a candidate's attributes into an organization, and vice versa, sell in the organizational attributes into prospective candidates. And I would source the candidates, I would arrange interviews and sell them into the client, and then I would manage that kind of job offer process through to the start point. And I did that for many years. I became a manager, a rather bumbling manager to begin with, but nevertheless, eventually a successful one. And then, funnily enough, that kind of bumbling manager piece led me several years later into learning and development, because I was lost. And I think a lot of people are lost when they first go into management, because as with lots of my former colleagues and people that I engage with now, what was happening was, people had perhaps been there the longest, they'd been successful in their role, and so they were promoted into a role that suddenly they knew nothing about, right? And so I was lost. I made mistakes. I probably spoke and behaved in ways that were probably not the best, if I'm honest. And in order to get the best out of my people, if that makes sense. So I wasn't doing that as well as I could have. And then I received some great training, and the organization I worked for were brilliant in the training field, which kind of also inspired me to move into learning and development with them. And importantly, I put some of the training into practice. Yeah, shock horror. So it's nice to know that some people actually do. And when I did, I noticed a profound change, a change in how I felt about a leadership role, and also the change that was then seen in the people in my team. And I don't even like saying in my team. We were a team together, and then. I don't know if you wanted this level of detail, but in 2000, I started in recruitment in 1998. I was very young. And then in 2008, of course, 7, 8, we had the financial crash. And suddenly, one of the things that you notice when you work in recruitment is that you're the first to know when an economic downturn is occurring, and one of the first to know when there's an economic upturn. And so we lost a lot of business as an organisation and as a team overnight, and we'd been hugely successful. And so my role as a manager changed. It had to change. And so I sometimes referred to myself as the accidental coach and motivator, because it was either lose my people because, they were struggling, frankly, or change my approach and become less selfish, because I had my own sales target, but I recognized at that moment that actually they were more important, and I had to invest. If I invest in my people, then they will perform, they will be motivated, and so on and so forth, and engaged. So that's what I did, and it turns out I was actually quite good at it, and more than that, perhaps, but I really enjoyed it, and I was very fulfilled by it, to really unlock people's potential in times of kind of economic hardship. So we got through, and we got through reasonably unscathed, and then, because I'd been a successful manager, you wouldn't think this was a reward, but I was invited to go and scale mountains in the Austrian Alps for 5 days and find myself, quote unquote, with a group of about 12 colleagues. And whilst I was hanging off the edge of a cliff, frightened out of my wits, I realised, had a bit of a moment where I realised actually what I wanted to do was to go into learning and development. I wanted to help more people, like I'd been able to support my unique team members. So long story short, end of 2010, I moved into learning and development, and boy, isn't it interesting when you do what you love. I thrived, and I thrived almost immediately in that role. I was hugely successful almost from day one, and I say that not from arrogance, just from that pure joy. Actually, it was so fulfilling, and I would teach new recruits how to be a recruiter, and then I was invited only a year and a half later to move into management development, because I'd been very successful. And of course, as I mentioned, the training was so brilliant that I was thrilled to become a part of it and redesign and improve and develop that further. So I did that. And just a year later, I was promoted to the head of management development, where I was now leading the strategic vision and the developmental goals for the entire global business, from sort of new managers right the way up to senior directors. And once again, I thrived in that role. And I know we're talking about sort of the why, really, and this is just part of my why, but kind of a corporate why to the step that I took then at the end of 2013. And I realised I didn't actually want, there was one other move I could make, and that was to the head of learning and development as a whole. And that inspired me less, to be honest. So I decided I didn't really want to do that, but I did want to go out, see the world, work and inspire and develop more and more people with their leadership skills, their sales skills, and so forth. And so I said it out loud. I remember saying to my partner, now wife, at the time, just one night, I said, I want to start my own business. And I actually thought she was going to say, what? Are you kidding? But actually she said in her wonderful, supportive way, I think that's a great idea. And probably about 3 or 4 months later, that was it. I set up my business, which is called Runway Global Limited. And I decided to call it that because I wanted to work globally. I never really had, but I wanted to. And the runway was a bit like that accelerator. It's the airport runway rather than the catwalk. And so I wanted to help people really accelerate their potential. All those kind of lovely cliches about reaching for the sky and all the rest of it. And you know, it was so interesting because in that first year of self-employment, I worked in 7 countries around the world, and I just never thought that would happen. And I really believe that in some strange way, I manifested that, you know, just through the title of my business. And I've been doing that ever since. Although I'm going to pause for a moment, but because obviously my business has slightly changed direction into the inclusion space, but I'll pause for a minute. I've talked a lot.
No, it's great. And I remember when we've spoken before that we have got this parallel world of both being in recruitment at the same time, which is, you know, it's great. And you described it as the first job working in recruitment as being purpose-filled. Now, are you looking back, or at the time, did you know that it was purpose-filled, or are you just looking back and seeing that now? Because I don't remember having that sort of purpose piece being around us, being aware of that at the time.
I think that's another great question. I think in part, yes, I'm looking back. In part, however, I always thought it was very interesting that when people came for interviews to become recruitment consultants, I mean, I'd been a holiday rep. I stepped off a plane, walked into an agency and said, have you got any jobs? I can sell, I know people. And they said, hey, fancy working for us? And that was it, you know, 15 years later. But anyway, and that's the story for a lot of recruiters, as you'll probably know. But I think that whole, when people used to come for actual interviews for recruiter roles, there was very much, and this is back in the day, there was very much a focus on whether somebody was target driven, sales focused, proactive to get on the phone, and it was all geared around the sales process, and that I thought was very, very interesting, and I still think that looking back, but I did at the time because I thought, you know, actually this is a role where helping people is the ultimate purpose, whether that's the client or whether that is the candidate. And yet, woe betide, and I take nothing away from the companies I worked with, but I think it was very much a general consensus that woe betide anybody say, I'd like to be a recruitment consultant because I want to help people. That was seen as a big no-no. And I think that world actually is changing a little bit to recognize that, you know, when you come from a place of deep purpose, you can train the other stuff. You can train people to make calls. You can train people to time manage, etc. But to have that innate purpose of wanting to support making somebody's life better, you can't train that. Not really. You know, that just comes from within. And I think there was always a deep sense of people saying to me, you know, why is it that you're so good at this? and interestingly, when I looked around at the cohorts, I mean, of course, there's hundreds and hundreds, thousands of people that work in this space, but it seemed to be, and it's a sweeping generalization, but in my world at that time, it seemed to be that people that had come from a background whereby there'd been some form of struggle, I will use that term, we could say challenge, we could say hardship, whatever, that seemed to be a driving force. And it was for me, you know, I came from a family, very loving family. I still have that loving family, I'm lucky to say, but a family that financially were not particularly affluent. And so it had been instilled in me to have a strong work ethic very early on. And that was a massive driver of my success. And I still believe that to this day, that is something that was instilled in me at an early age and has stayed with me for the rest of my life. And I hope it never leaves me, actually. I can't see that happening because it's just part of me, you know. So, yeah, does that answer your question? But I think, you know, that's kind of how it felt for me.
And what I'm seeing also is that your role in recruitment wasn't enough because you said you wanted to work and inspire and develop with as many people as possible. So when you're working one-to-one, finding roles for one-to-one, that's great. You're changing their lives, but one by one, whereas you seem to want to work with more people and have a bigger impact.
Yeah, I kind of think, why wouldn't you, right? If you can touch more people in one go, as it were, then why wouldn't that be appealing to somebody that loves to support and help people, right? And so, yeah, I think just that move into learning and development made a massive difference to me. And then, sort of later on, moving into the D&I, the diversity and inclusion space, has made a phenomenal difference to me. Yeah.
And you're sat talking to me in front of a map of the world. And I can't help but obviously seeing Runway Global, it just makes sense because you've just got the whole world behind you. What is the dream?
Oh, I mean, the map, and I may have told you this before, Amy, but my map represents the fact that, yes, I think there's a whole world out there. And the more digital we become, and actually perhaps this year we've been able to see how small this world can be and how easy, not easy, but how much more easier it can be to touch the lives of people around the world. But the map also represents the uniqueness of every one of us, in that we all have our own unique map of the world, right? Perspectives, experiences, belief systems, and values. So, yeah, I forgot the question because I got so engrossed in telling you about my map. But it's a hugely representative of who I am and what I do. I remembered the dream. What's the dream? I genuinely believe I'm living that dream. The dream is to do what I love every day, to do something that gives me energy, and to be able to make a living doing that while still fulfilling that purpose of supporting others in terms of their understanding, in terms of their development, and in terms of accelerating their own potential uniquely in the way that is going to enhance their life, because that enhances my life by consequence.
And you've niched into an area which is diversity and inclusion as a result of your experiences and sort of personal experiences. Explain how important it is that the world is of or full of diversity and inclusion.
Sure. Well, I mean, honestly, the world already is full of diversity, right? As just said, we all have a unique map of the world. Diversity is indeed all around us. Leveraging that diversity, however, in a space that is cultivated to welcome everybody's opinion, views, beliefs in an equal way. That's sort of true inclusion, I guess. And I can tell you the story as to why it's important to me, because I speak about it publicly now. And this is kind of just to preempt your, is that looking back or forward type question. This is a very looking back and now taking that and taking it forward. So well, you probably can tell because I told you about my wife. So, I'm gay, and I realised that at a very early age. Truth be told, I probably realised that before I hit puberty, because I had strange crushes on female teachers, which, looking back, I'm not quite sure why. But anyway, and then so I think it became a thing, where there was a label attached to it, probably when I was around 13 or 14. And I'm an only child. I was raised as Catholic, and those two things presented quite a challenge, of course, because I had no siblings to bounce off or discuss. It was just me and mum and dad. And of course, homosexuality is a sin in the Catholic faith, and so and my mum especially is a very strict Catholic, and so I was extremely frightened at that point in my life, because I didn't want to be this person with this label, and I couldn't do anything about it. I went out with in just a few years, I went out with quite a few boys, I have to say, and didn't do anything I shouldn't have been at that kind of age. But certainly I was desperate to fall in love with a boy, and it just didn't happen. Now, somebody that was hugely opposed and thinking that this was a life choice may argue that, well, how do you know at 13, 14? I knew, and it just didn't feel right at all. I sent my apologies to all those boys I wasted their time with. But anyway, and so when I got to around 15, I eventually opened up to a couple of friends at school who were good friends, and they were reasonably accepting of it. You know, this new strange thing. It was a bit like, you know, the only gay in the village type thing. And but what they did do is what teenagers do, and I don't hold it against them. Is they talked. You know, they told other people and all the rest of it. And before I knew it, you know, it was kind of around the school, and unfortunately not everybody was quite so understanding. The names were called the laugh and the finger pointing and so forth. And my behaviour had changed. You know, I'd gone from being quite an extroverted young girl, young teenager, to reasonably withdrawn, to be honest. And I see that only looking back again. And my parents noticed. My parents noticed something was different, and it wasn't just that sort of cheeky teenager kind of thing. And so I tell people the story of, you know, when I came out of the closet, because I didn't really. I was kind of dragged out of the closet. My parents sat me down one night, and they basically said, "Look, I was going out to meet some friends, and I actually did have my first girlfriend at the time, so that was all very exciting. But they said, right, you're not going out until we know what's the matter." And I thought, and I literally thought, my life's over. My life's over. They'll find out. They'll throw me out. They'll stop loving me. And you know, we were, and thankfully still are, a very close family. So this was just a devastating moment, you know. And I sat there, and then I just kept saying things like, "Oh, there's nothing wrong with me, you know, no, I'm fine." And that bravado coming through. But of course, you know, parents know, those that love you, they know when something's not quite right. And so my dad eventually said, "Look, you come with me." He said, "We'll leave your mum here." He said, "You come with me." And we had a garage that was detached from our house. So it's like walking down the end of the garden. So I had to follow him. And it was, you know, it was a bit like the walk of shame, really. And I thought, gosh, I've just no idea what's going to happen next. And when we got in that garage, my dad started to guess what was wrong. And he asked me several quite deep questions. He asked me if I was pregnant. He asked me if I was being abused. He asked me if I was on drugs. And of course, you know, all of those things made me think, wow, you know, there's a real worry that there's something horrific potentially at play here. And it was a really interesting thing because, again, am I looking back or was that in the moment? I don't know. But certainly he eventually just, because I said, "Look, you know, if I tell you, will you still love me?" And, you know, all those kind of things. And of course I was crying and it was terrible and everything. And he just suddenly clicked his fingers and he said, "You know, you think you're queer, don't you?" And I said, "I know I am, Dad. I know I am." And of course I broke down. And the biggest example, and I use this when I speak on stages now, the biggest example of inclusion was right there and then when he, and it gets me now, right? He opened up his arms and he gave me a hug and he said, "Is that all?" And now, obviously, it wasn't all, you know, but in that moment, despite what he might have been feeling, and I can imagine that he too was filled with dread, actually, at what the future might hold, not just for them, but more so for me and what my life would now have in store, having this different lifestyle. Yet, in that moment, I say to people, love prevailed right in that moment. And that is what inclusion is. It's love, even if you don't understand what it is you're loving. It's love, even if you don't know if you want to love, right? That is inclusion right there. And, you know, long story short, we told mum. Well, he did. I ran upstairs and hid, and then he told mum, and there was a silence when I heard him say it. And I thought she'd passed out, but she hadn't. I think she was just taking it in. And then, you know, from there, you know, conversations and discussions happened. My parents have always been good talkers, you know, good conversationalists. So they'll seek to understand, which is such an important thing. And, you know, my mum has reconciled that her faith with her love for me, and you know, and that's been unwavering, and in fact both have been unwavering. She's come to terms with that, and I wonder sometimes, you know, it's interesting, isn't it, when you hit certain pivotal moments in your life, and it's a bit of a sliding doors moment, isn't it? You know, what would have happened if? And I've always felt incredibly grateful for my parents' love and understanding, even if it challenged them in a way that they didn't truly understand at that time. And so this is a long story to talk about this journey, but, you know, people think, you know, this would have been 1986, 87, something like that. And, you know, it was only in the early 90s, in the early 80s that we had things like the first Pride March, you know, AIDS awareness and so on. And so I still, when I was sort of probably 17, but I'll say 18 because it was legal then, when I went out to bars and so on, and I eventually started to find, you know, as was gay bars, you know, you still had to knock on a door and to see if you'd be allowed in, you know, for safety measures and levels of gay bashing. So, but it's not altogether that much different now. And that's the sad thing. 30, 40 years on nearly, you know, there are still people experiencing prejudice and discrimination because of their sexuality, because of their gender identity, and of course, all other elements of diversity. You know, race, as we know most recently, has come to our awareness. Those with disabilities, hidden and otherwise. You know, there are so, even just gender as well, you know, male-female divide. So my absolute purpose now, and it was joining the PSA 2 years ago. I actually started to talk about my own story, part of what I've just shared with you, and I realised, because I put myself out there in a reasonably safe community, but I still wasn't sure how it would be received. And you can probably imagine there's a whole lot more to the story, but those are the key points. And it was actually received with kindness and at least attempted understanding, and so it gave me the courage, I think. You know, I sort of then thought, you know, I'm in my mid-40s now, and if I can't talk about this now, because I'm not ashamed of who I am, it's felt very challenging at times. And you know, all those years in recruitment, I never came out of the closet until the latter years when I met my now wife 13 years ago. So, you know, I still hid part of myself for the fear of repercussions, you know, the bullying again, the being held back from promotions and not really being seen for my ability and seen instead for the labels that people gave me. So now it's so important to me to help organizations realize the power of their language and behavior. This is where it goes. We've gone full circle, right? So that people experiencing any kind of difference in their life, whether they're a child really coming out of the closet or somebody with a whole different story, but so they can, with safety and with being welcomed, really, can step out into the world without fear of reprisal for that identity, and whether that identity is something that is inbuilt, as I believe my sexuality is inbuilt. I don't believe there was choice, or whether I had made a choice. So what if I had made a choice? Identity doesn't seek to harm anybody. It seeks to free people. And if we can't feel free as who we are, then something isn't quite right in this world, is it? I'll pause.
Well, Jackie, thank you for sharing that. And I can see how emotional just describing those moments all those years ago still sort of evokes all of that. It must have been really difficult. I can sort of sense that. And what I'm sort of hearing is diversity and inclusion the right words, or is it a case of freedom, love, kindness, belonging that would actually sort of encapsulate, really, essentially it comes down to love?
100%. Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest about this, because I'm a corporate girl from a corporate world, and I hope there will be listeners that can this resonates with, because ultimately, yes, inclusion is love. It's unconditional love, like you would hope a parent has for a child, even a pet owner has for their beloved, pet. But it's an unconditional love regardless. Unfortunately, I think if I was to go into, big corporate organization and say, hi, I'm Jackie Handy, I'm here to spread some love across your organization, I think they'd kind of freak out a little bit, because love is something that's not used in the corporate world enough, actually. So yeah, you're right, Amy. It is about love. It is about freedom. And I do use the term belonging because, there's loads of cliches about diversity, is inviting someone to your party, blah, 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 blah. But, diversity for me is simply our difference. It's just that unique map of the world that we all have. So that's diversity. Inclusion is feeling valued for that difference, feeling braced from that difference. And then belonging is something that is felt. That is it. You cannot simply say to somebody, you are being included. They have to feel that within, that they feel safe, that to open up to people around them about who they are, good, bad, indifferent. They have to feel valued for their contribution, and people have to be made to feel like they have a place of worth. Because if I had not felt that I had, and been made in that moment with my dad to have had that place of worth, I genuinely don't know if I'd still be here. I mean that, because there are some statistics, and they've been around a while, so I don't know if there's any change in it, but certainly, if you fall into one or more minority group, you are twice as likely to self-harm. And 1 in 4 people that fall into one or more minority group have considered or attempted suicide. So, these are real statistics that come just simply from a lack of love. And so there can be, for me, no stronger why as to what I do. If I can make a difference, I know I've said, why wouldn't I want to many? But actually, if I can make a difference to just one person, and, I teach organizations to take away the boxes, to understand what the boxes mean to the individual, but actually to look at the person, the human being to the left and to the right of them, and to seek to understand them and their identity and the language that they prefer used when describing them, pronouns and so forth, but also the behaviours that they need to feel that their contribution matters, to feel loved and to feel as though they belong. Because it doesn't matter what the box is, it matters the person in front of us at any given moment in time. And that, Amy, is simply why I do what I do right now.
Well, I've written it down. I write loads of notes while I'm listening to what you're saying, and the belonging, the B for the belonging, and the I for inclusion, and the D for diversity spells bid. And I see, like, you've got this bid for freedom, you've got this bid for love, and I absolutely love it, Jackie. And I can see how much it's going to be spreading across the corporate world. And I do feel that there is an opportunity for that corporate barrier to sort of come down at some point? Because essentially we all show up at work as individuals, and together we become that sort of corporate entity. But essentially we're just people, and we are all living these lives. And I think that's the one thing that we've discovered is in this digital world that we're living in this year and that COVID has brought to us, is actually, I think, sort of companies have become a lot more humane.
Yeah, I say to people when I work with them that, it's a journey, and it's just simply about starting that journey with one step. And, I genuinely feel that if everyone on the planet had taken one step forward towards creating and cultivating these environments based on love and belonging, wow, wouldn't the planet already be in a different place, So it doesn't happen overnight. It does take a concerted effort from organizations. And, I do think you're right in that the world is waking up to this. And I hope that organizations do start to just remember, really. I mean, not every organization is bad for this, of course, but more and more to make it become more habitual in organizations that that love and belonging are prevalent factors in businesses, because people spend so much of their life at work, and especially right now, when the organizations that have been focusing on the health and well-being of their people and showing them love, they are the ones that have whether they've been able to thrive will depend on many factors, but certainly they are the ones that will survive and come out better. I'm convinced of that in the long run, because those people feel valued, and that's what we all want in life, isn't it? To feel that we have a place, that we're valued and our contribution matters. So you see how these things just simply go hand in hand.
Well, Jackie Handy, I see exactly how it goes hand in hand. And how will people get in contact with you?
Thank you, Amy. Well, I'm sure you'll put my links and things like that on the on your website with the podcast. My website is simply jackiehandy.com. I have a little book called The Little Book of Belonging as well, which is your weekly guide to inclusive habits, which is a really lovely, reflective book, actually. It doesn't dictate how you should do stuff, but it gets people focusing on their journey and their small steps. So you can find that through my website as well. I'm on YouTube, Jackie Handy, and if you're in the corporate world, then you'll find me on LinkedIn, again, Jackie Handy. You will find me.
Well, I'll make sure that all of those links go into the show notes. And of course, the Little Book of Belonging, which is actually not a book, it's a flip book.
It is, yeah. It actually sits so that's why it's only available on my website. So thank you for reminding me to say that. It's a desktop book. So it's lovely, actually, because it's designed every week. You turn the page, there's a reflection and a question that helps people on that journey. So nice little stocking filler as well. If we get this out for Christmas, I don't know. But certainly, it doesn't matter when you start, just start. That's what I would say. Oh, and just one other thing, and that is, I know you might know this, Amy, but I've done a TEDx as well called The Exclusive Nature of Inclusion. So check that out as well.
Well, I'll put that link in as well. And Jackie, it's been an absolute privilege sharing your why with the audience today. I really have enjoyed hearing all about your sort of past and how it's sort of brought you to where you are today. So thank you very much for sharing some very personal moments.
Oh, that's been my pleasure. Thank you again, Amy, for inviting me on this podcast. And I hope your listeners enjoy the story.
Well, I'm sure they will. And have you got some final words for them today, please?
Yeah, I've always got words, haven't I? But funnily enough, I find myself thinking maybe I've said everything that needs to be said. In a world that challenges us regularly in our own unique ways, love always prevails. So, I leave that again, small steps. That's all it takes, small steps.
Thank you for listening to the Focus on Why podcast. I'm Amy Rowlandson, and if you've enjoyed this episode, please leave me a 5-star Apple Podcast review. Connect with me on LinkedIn, Instagram and Facebook and become a member of my inspiring, uplifting and positive Focus on Why Facebook group. I help people to focus on their why with clarity, uniting their passion with their purpose with a plan to create the life they truly desire. If you would like me to help you focus on your why, then please book a free 20-minute coaching call via calendly.com/Amy Rowlandson. And if you haven't already, please sign up for the Friday Focus weekly newsletter via my website, amyrowlandson.com. Have a purpose, have a plan, focus on why.